Forgot to do that. Call this meeting to order. Very obviously, the mayor is not here. He's back in Washington, D.C., attending to some official business in his regular capacity, and Councilmember Boo Black will be joining us shortly. There will be open opportunity throughout the hearing this evening for any public participation, as many as would like to comment, and we'll acknowledge the lady in the fourth row from the back. In any case, there is no formal action to be taken. This is a presentation that will be discussed during our regular meeting. Any declaration of conflicts of interests or disqualification? Okay. So the item before us, an ordinance amendment, 2016-02. This is a workshop. We're going to be discussing amendments to Chapter 5-16, Christmas tree sales lots, and Title IX zoning regulations of the Turlock Municipal Code. I'd like to call on Ms. Whitmore.
Yes, this evening I also have Katie Quintero with me. She's our senior planner, and she'll be doing about half of this presentation tonight. This is an ordinance amendment. Every year or two, we try to bring forward to you amendments to the zoning ordinance that we hope will actually make it a little bit more helpful and to also streamline some of the processes that we have in the planning division and in the development services department. What I'm going to do tonight is to go through the ordinance development process, just so you have a little history on what the Planning Commission has done to bring this forward to you, discuss the overall purpose of the proposed amendments, give you a quick overview of minor changes. A lot of the changes that we're going to be discussing tonight are relatively technical and really don't affect development rights for individual property owners, but they do allow us to become more consistent with state law and to make the ordinance a little easier to read. We are going to cover in some depth the major changes that are proposed in this ordinance amendment, and those deal with the 4 topics that you have in front of you, and we'll go through those in some depth, so because they are actually a change in policy for the city. And then we can take questions on any of the changes that are being proposed. You do have in your workshop agenda packet a table summarizing the ordinance amendments and the various sections that are being sort of touched by this comprehensive update, and kind of the reasons why, in very simple terms, why we are making these changes to the ordinance. The Planning Commission spent a great deal of time, as they usually do, on an ordinance amendment package. We've been basically working on this ordinance package for about 1.5 years with the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission held specific workshops on the undergrounding of utilities, on the noise ordinance, on the landscaping ordinance, and on our regulations dealing with wireless communications. We did try to solicit feedback from the community on how we would approach these issues. Oftentimes we did not get that kind of feedback and participation, but I can assure you that the Planning Commission spent a great deal of time considering the direction. We looked back at what other cities have done and tried to learn from their examples and their experiences and how to address these issues. The Planning Commission held their hearing and unanimously recommended that you approve these proposed amendments on August 4th of 2016. And again, just to kind of recap, the purpose of these amendments, as they are throughout the year, is that we get feedback from the public at the front counter through the development review process when we're going through permitting processes that give us feedback on the ordinance and what could be improved and changed. We do get occasional requests from the public to review the ordinance and to come back with a different approach, and that is something that the Planning Commission considers. We also like to review the administration of the zoning ordinance and determine whether or not it's up to date with regard to kind of current business practice. We also have to respond to changes in state and federal law. We oftentimes are given more specific direction in terms of the definitions of various kinds of uses that we have here in the city, and we like our ordinance to be consistent with those changes. And then, of course, we like to make the ordinance a little easier to read and to understand. The minor changes, I have 2 slides here to cover sort of the minor changes that are being proposed this evening. The first has to do with Christmas tree sales lots. We've basically extended the period of time, both at the front end and at the back end of the operating period for these lots, to give the operators a little bit more time to have their initial setup right after Thanksgiving, and then to have a little bit more time, about a week at the end of the process, to break down their lots and to do the cleanup on the sites. We've made some changes in the definitions section of the zoning ordinance. In these three areas, nightclub, bars, and restaurants have always been an area where, yes, restaurants serve alcohol and occasionally bars serve some level of food, but exactly how are we going to determine what that line is? So we attempted to come up with a little bit more of a bright line where we do have kind of that, this is definitely a bar and this is going to be a restaurant. What we've also done is to kind of collapse some of our current definitions. We have dancing and live entertainment, and we have restaurants and bars, but some of these are put together in nightclubs, okay? And so rather than having all of these separate definitions in the zoning ordinance, instead we've sort of said, hey, nightclubs can be a number of different kinds of things. They can be bars with dancing and live entertainment. They might have any combination of those kinds of events going on. And it allows us to give more clear direction to the public as to what the permitting processes are going to be for those types of uses. Family daycare homes, again, this is one that we're aligning more directly with state law in terms of how that definition is reading. And then with group homes, group quarters, and convalescent hospitals, again, there's been a little bit of confusion, not only for the public but for staff in terms of how do we address issues like nursing homes. Do they fall into the convalescent hospital kind of category, or are they really group homes? So now we've created a very bright line that those types of residential care facilities are going to be in the group home category. Convalescent hospitals are going to be more of the commercial uses where you're doing rehabilitation, but they're not necessarily sort of a residential use for people that are in more of a group housing situation. Building projections into yards, we're making a little bit more flexible for people to add patios onto their homes as we start seeing more small lot, single-family homes. A lot of the individual homeowners are being prevented from having patio covers, which are extensions of the home. And so we allow them to be built in a way that is similar to our accessory structures, in that they can be a little bit closer to the property line, just like an accessory structure can. And so we're hoping that that will give more flexibility to homeowners in, kind of creating that outside environment that they want for themselves and for their children. The mobile home on-street parking time limit is changing from 48 hours to 72 hours. Again, this is a request that we got from the Neighborhood Services Division. They wanted to align our parking limits for mobile homes when they're being loaded and unloaded to align with state law as it relates to abandoned vehicles. They were having difficulty implementing and enforcing that regulation, and they thought that this would help them to provide clear direction to the public. With regard to recycling and solid waste facilities that are required for most commercial uses, we have received a lot of complaints from people about not only the noise, but the odor, and some of the collection of people that will come to a solid waste facility. So we are requiring some additional setbacks for residential areas to hopefully reduce those impacts on adjacent homes. The district regulations for group homes and group quarters, nightclubs, are also being changed to align with the new definitions that we just created, but the permitting processes are not going to change. So they're simply going to be kind of put into new categories within these new definitions. We have also made it clear, a little bit more clear, this was something that probably is more of a holdover from Turlock in its additional setbacks for that second story type of structure. On the administration side, we're allowing for the electronic transmittal of notices and other documents. We often get requests from the public that these types of notices come electronically, so we are adding that feature to the administration section of the zoning ordinance. We are changing the term outdoor dining to outdoor seating. A lot of people don't necessarily want to have dining per se on the outside area, but in connection with the food service, they want to have an area where people can sit and basically enjoy the outdoor area in the downtown. So that's just kind of more of a nomenclature for that particular part of the ordinance. We are also looking at extending the duration of seasonal sales on a single property in our temporary use of land section from 90 days to 135 days. This arose in one instance where a property owner wanted to have the ability for someone to sell some of these items that are more seasonal in nature, pumpkins, Christmas trees, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day. And so the 90 days actually would have prevented them from being able to use their property in that manner. So by going to 135 days, they can basically have someone there for all the typical holidays. Are there any questions on any of those before we move to the more detailed? Yes.
So, we have the additional days added now to the 145. Is county looking at that, or are we gonna be commiserate to that? Obviously, there's one place that's gonna be a city-county area of concern.
In terms of the seasonal sales, I think it'll align fairly closely with what they have allowed in that permit. So this won't necessarily create any kind of a conflict. It's actually going to allow for a little bit more flexibility for uses within the city. Yeah.
I have a question about the bars, restaurants / nightclubs. Allows restaurants to sell small amounts of alcoholic products.
It just clarifies that that's what they do. And we never had that in our ordinance, and there was some question in the minds of staff and the public as to whether or not that was something that was permitted.
So does that now allow restaurants to do that without going through the ABC permitting process?
No,
or-
our ordinance doesn't affect the state law and its requirements, so those regulations would still apply.
Okay, define small amounts. What does that mean?
Again, the way that our ordinance reads is that when the alcohol sales is the predominant focus of the business in terms of the amount of, product that is being sold and the dollar amount that you receive in terms of sales, then that becomes a bar. And we generally do align those with the alcohol and beverage control licenses that are issued. We often look at what the license is that is being requested by the property owner to make that determination. Restaurants, on the other hand, their focus is on food sales, and alcohol is more of a kind of an accessory type of product that is being offered by those businesses.
Great, thanks.
And just one additional clarifying question. Debbie, were you talking about residential elderly homes? There are already multiple levels of regulations, both federal and state and county. Are we now adding another layer of oversight and requirements as a city on these facilities? I mean, residential care for the elderly regulations are already fairly stiff.
No, we're not adding any regulations. We're just making the determination as to where these uses
So
would
a
be
zoning.
permitted. What we've done in the definition is that group homes are those types of facilities that do have state licensing. And so the permitting process is a little bit more expedited compared to those types of group quarters where we do not have a state license that is involved. So where a state license is involved, we expect that there is more control over how these particular uses are operating, whereas when there is no state license involved, the neighbors may have a little bit more concern. And so we've elevated those types of uses to a public hearing to give the neighbors in the area an opportunity to provide more feedback.
Thank you.
I had a question also on the nightclub bar definitions. To me, I always thought, a bar, Staley's is a bar, for example, okay? No doubt about it. You can get food there on occasion, but it's basically a bar. Restaurants typically, the primary function, yes, is to sell food, but they have alcohol available. Restaurant, you can have your kids in there because the primary function is food. Bar, no kids. Now, the definition on nightclub, do we have any nightclubs in Turlock?
The nightclub is a new definition in that we had sort of dancing and live entertainment that were separate uses as defined in the zoning ordinance. And then you could have uses like we do in the downtown with like the Vintage Lounge, where you have combinations of those types of activities. You have some dancing, you have some live entertainment, and you also have alcohol service that is being offered. So the nightclub definition really combines all of those elements instead of us having to, if somebody just decides that they want to have bands, now we put them through a conditional use permit, they can come in and say, well, we might want to offer any of these types of services as part of our business, and therefore then they fall into the nightclub category. The permitting processes are pretty similar between nightclubs and bars, and it's very similar to what our previous definitions of live entertainment and dancing were. So it's not really changing, again, the permitting process, it's just making the definitions a little simpler.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Why don't you come forward and use the mic so people can hear you?
They don't have it.
This is just a, whole nightclub bar. So, does this work?
No, that's it.
So I'm a little late to the party here. So a nightclub is food, drink, and live entertainment, basically.
And dancing or some
So
combination of those.
would the Italian restaurant Strings be? I mean, it sometimes has live entertainment. Would that be classified as a nightclub, practically?
One of the changes that we made is we know that there are many restaurants here in town that want to have sort of what I call more dinner music. And it might come in the form of a person that is playing a guitar or playing a piano, something that is very light and relatively low sound level. So we have actually changed the definition of restaurant to allow for that kind of music to be operated within those businesses. And again, it just comes down to what is really acceptable here in the city in terms of the type of entertainment that is offered. There is a decibel limit that is put on that type of music, so that it does remain sort of background music and it doesn't become kind of the central focus of the restaurant activity.
Oh, and Michael Puffer, by the way.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Debbie?
One quick question. Yeah, again, back to the nightclub. One of the definitions I see in there is dancing, but as far as I thought there was really no dancing allowed in the bars in Turlock. I mean, is there actually?
Oh, yeah, no, we've
'Cause I've
permitted
had-
dancing in bar in bars that have been permitted here in the city. So it is something that you can do. There is a separate permitting process that you have to go through the police department. But it definitely has been approved as part of, existing bar activities.
Please continue, Debbie.
Okay, so now we're going to delve into the kind of the more detailed, the more policy oriented types of changes that we're making within the ordinance. One of the areas that we often hear back from developers is a requirement in our current ordinance that all utilities should be undergrounded, and particularly with regard to sort of the high power lines that distribute electricity to a property. We get a lot of pushback from developers because this undergrounding is very expensive. And so the fact that we require that these existing wires to be undergrounded often creates a very definite financial impact on a project. The current ordinance is pretty black and white. It says everything has to be undergrounded. If you're developing a property, anything that basically bounds that property is to be undergrounded. The only real exception is if you're remodeling an existing building. So that doesn't give a lot of wiggle room in terms of where staff can go on this requirement. What we have seen over time is that staff has been trying to be more reasonable in how we're applying the requirement. So when we do see, an excessive cost that's being basically put on a project, or if TID, for example, comes out and says, hey, you know, if you're gonna underground this, you're gonna end up with just as many poles when you get done as what you're gonna do if you underground it. We wanted to come up with an ordinance that would provide us with more clear direction on what we can and cannot do in these circumstances, and also give a process that's a little bit more flexible by providing a system of waivers and potential variances that the Planning Commission can approve in these cases. So basically what we ended up coming up with, and this was after an extensive review of what other cities are doing, and believe me, it's kind of across the board as to how cities approach this issue, is that any new utility lines would be undergrounded. And that's fairly simple. I mean, they're putting in the power at this point, so undergrounding those utilities at that point is not that difficult. Where it starts becoming more of an issue for developers is when you're undergrounding existing overhead lines. So the way the ordinance reads is that when it is located on the property to be developed, that should be undergrounded. That when it's within the street between the center line and the property, the center line of the adjacent street and the property, then it would be undergrounded. And then if it's within 6 feet of the property lines. Now, with all that being said, we've incorporated some exceptions that we think are pretty practical in terms of what would automatically be accepted from this requirement. Emergency facilities that are typically in place for 30 days or less, for construction-related utility poles that are required to build buildings. Temporary uses of land, like our mobile food vendors, are not required to underground their utilities. Utilities, of course, that the Public Utilities Commission won't let you underground, which is, you know, kind of goes without being said. Overhead service lines to adjacent lots that are not controlled by the developer. And this often happens where the power is actually coming from another direction on a property that developer cannot control. So to require that developer then to underground that utility would make it very difficult on them. And then for electrical transmission lines that are 69 kilovolts and above, this was a request from the Turlock Irrigation District. These are large transmission lines, and they are extremely expensive to underground, and TID would prefer that they not be undergrounded. So those are kind of automatic exceptions. We've also incorporated a waiver process whereby the city engineer, Mike Pitcock, could make exceptions based on what are really kind of practical considerations for undergrounding. When the off-site lines are not required to be undergrounded and boring from the opposite side of the street is required, again, that's a pretty expensive process and sometimes creates difficulty in actually implementing a project. Where it's infeasible or impractical due to the physical conditions. It's infeasible or impractical based on sound engineering and architectural practices. Where in a remodeling situation where the remodeling cost is 50% or less of the appraised value of the property for tax purposes, and when the length of the line is less than 600 feet and the cost of the work to underground the utilities exceeds 25% of the overall cost of the project. So again, this gives a lot more flexibility to the city engineer and a lot more guidance in those kinds of things that can be done at a staff level. And we can automatically exempt those developers in those cases. Now, if none of these are working for the developer, then at that point they can go to the Planning Commission and ask for a variance. In a variance condition, you're looking at extreme exceptional cases. So the Planning Commission would be authorized to grant these variances, but only if they can make the following findings: that the variance is required to allow for the logical and orderly development of the surrounding area, and the developer agrees to enter into a deferral agreement with the city to underground utilities at a time specific or upon demand by the city as a condition of approval. So if it becomes reasonable at a future date for the developer for that property to underground the facilities, then they would, the city would be asking them to do that. So this gives a lot of leeway to the Planning Commission to examine the circumstances of the case and make a determination. We intentionally meant that it would be a little bit broad and not as specific, so the Planning Commission can take into consideration circumstances that we can't possibly imagine at this point.
Debbie, a quick question about the last provision there under the waiver description. Talking about 25% of the overall cost. Are there any circumstances in your vision that could be 23 or 24% where you would cost it, or conversely 26 or 27% where you would not?
Yeah, we tried to collect information during the public hearing process on just what the percentage of the cost is for undergrounding these types of utilities. We know what the dollar amount is, but we weren't really able to collect the information on specific projects as to kind of what is the common percentage of the overall cost of a project for this type of undergrounding. We're hoping that by putting this in place, as we start kind of applying it and seeing what projects actually fall into this category, we'll get a better understanding of whether or not that 25% is the right number. The 25% is a number that we've seen other cities use, but we have also seen them use 10%. So I think that's something that we can come back and revisit as we get a little bit better understanding of just how expensive and, you know, how much of a burden this does place onto a development project.
So in the meantime, until we've assembled that data, we're going to be kind of,
Well, there is the variance process that they could be taking this forward and asking for permission from the planning commission to do that.
thank you.
Can you describe a little bit more what the TID lines are that they're requesting to not underground?
Yeah, there are several lines that run through the city that actually transmit the electricity. They're the very high voltage lines that distribute the electricity to the distribution lines that typically take those to individual properties and to developments. So you'll notice these, they typically have, you know, sort of several layers of wires on them, and yeah, that's about all I can really say about it. It kind of gets more into technical detail than I know much about, but
So we're changing it so that those don't need to be underground anymore for the reason that it's expensive for TID to do
well,
that?
it's expensive, and the ongoing maintenance of those would be far more expensive to TID. And there aren't that many of these lines in the city, but the structures are extremely substantial. I mean, you will notice these lines. There's one on Gear Road. These are not your typical electrical poles that you're used to seeing on a neighborhood street.
Sort of wondering whether that's a good thing to have more of these large, high voltage lines.
Well, it's not that you would have, allow more of them, it's just that these are the ones that already exist within the city.
So they don't have any plans to make more of those?
Not that I'm aware of at this point.
And by changing this, if in the future they were to make them, they would be allowed to continue to make them above ground?
That would be, they would probably come to us in the form of a project for us to review, and we would be given the opportunity to provide feedback on where they're being placed. Typically, those type of transmission lines actually go through their own environmental process, and they're routed to agencies for review. Any other questions? Okay, very good. On the noise standards, and we have identified that there are some reference problems in this particular section. The current references are to the existing ordinance rather than the new placement of the ordinance, so we'll be proposing those changes at the regular meeting as part of your action. But what I wanted to cover in this section is to just kind of give you an overview of the changes that are being proposed. We've been kind of toying with the idea of addressing our noise standards ever since the general plan was adopted in 2012. We know that we need to bring it into conformance with the general plan, which really isn't a huge change from what our existing noise standards are. But there was a little bit of a confusion in terms of how we apply it in the current ordinance, in that we had broken the city into three types of conditions. We had a designation for urban, one for suburban, and then one that it was called rural suburban. And nobody really knew here at the city where those areas were and how they were defined. So it was a little hard for staff to determine exactly which standard we should be applying in a specific instance. So we've simplified that, gotten rid of all those different classifications, and instead just come up with a standard that is based entirely on the general plan standard. We have added a noise standard for amplified sound. Amplified sound is a different wavelength that is perceived by the human ear in a different way. There is actually a different type of sound metric that is used to measure this type of sound, and it tends to be the type of sound, particularly the bass beat of amplified sound. It actually tends to be more annoying to individuals. And so we've incorporated a new standard that will reflect that kind of desirable noise level within the city and allow us to better enforce it in specific instances. We have increased the construction-related noise standards to align more closely with Caltrans standards. Our engineering division was finding that our standards were a little bit too stringent, and it was difficult for people to carry out normal construction-related activities. The actual noise standard itself is really only increasing by about 10 decibels, and they are still well within the acceptable limits for residential types of neighborhoods. But it does give, construction companies and our own engineering division a little bit more flexibility in performing these types of construction-related activities. We still have the time of day restrictions on construction-related activities, so they can't be done late in the evening when it would be most annoying to residential neighborhoods. But it does give a little bit more flexibility during the day when these types of activities typically occur. Again, kind of dealing with trash enclosures and trash compactors, which tend to annoy residents, is that we've placed a time limit as to when they can be done when you're adjacent to a residential neighborhood. And we have proposed an exemption for school activities and city tree and park maintenance activities, which are kind of normal types of activities that are done. As it relates to city tree and park maintenance, we're still applying the same standard that would apply to anyone who is operating that type of equipment, but only if they're within 200 feet of a residence. Okay, so are there any questions on the noise standards section? At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Quintero to handle the next two items.
Good evening. So the next item, we looked at making changes to our landscaping section of the ordinance. It's actually two sections of the ordinance. There is a section specific to landscaping for parking lots, and then the landscaping section. But the changes overall are pretty uniform to the two different sections. They predominantly revolve around changes that have come about in state law that we need to make sure that we're consistent with those requirements, or that we are not in any way creating obstacles to how projects have to be designed to comply with those requirements. So the first are the changes for the MS4 requirements. So this is requirements, changes in the way that projects have to handle stormwater runoff. So looking at now handling the stormwater on site. And so for a lot of the ways that is done is through the landscaped areas. So as one of the main goals of the landscaping ordinance, we've added in that landscaping, one of the purposes is to be able to implement the low impact design strategies that are required with the stormwater requirements. And then also clarifying throughout multiple sections that the curbing that's required around landscaped areas, adjacent to parking areas, that you can have openings within it so that water can run off and run into those landscaped areas. So just making sure and clarifying that we would allow that to occur. The other big changes to the landscaping ordinance are to comply with state law regarding the model water efficient landscaping ordinance. So this is about making sure that the landscaping that's being installed is water efficient, essentially. So we had an allowance or requirement for berms, for example. So in creating, a landscaped area that had a slope to prevent headlights in parking areas shining over. Well, berms are now within the new model water efficient landscape ordinance not permitted, because you have to water them more as you have the slope, the water's running off. So that's something we've totally taken out. Another change is that in the landscape ordinance, we already have language that required landscaping has to be installed prior to occupancy, but we've clarified in residential projects that if it's that it has to be for the front yard, developer installed landscaping has to be installed prior to final occupancy. And this is clarified basically the triggers and process that staff uses for reviewing the landscape plans for the front yard single-family homes to make sure that they comply with the water-efficient landscape standards. We've done something similar for homeowner-installed front yards, but have built in the possibility that they can have a deferral agreement in place. Oftentimes, if it's someone's building their own custom home, the landscaping is something that comes after they've moved in and gotten things in place. So we've allowed for that to occur, but making sure that we still, at the time they are going to install the landscaping, that we're reviewing the plans and making sure that they're being installed and designed consistently with the water-efficient landscape requirements. We've changed the thresholds that trigger the ordinance, and that is square footages that come straight from the state law. And then we've updated the model home landscape requirements, and again, those are consistent within the WELO. There's specific requirements for model homes, what they need to do, and so we've updated our section to reflect what is in the state law. The next section that we changed is our municipal code section in regulating wireless communication facilities. And again, this is primarily in response to state law requirements, but also some clarification of the ordinance. It's one section that whenever someone comes into the counter, staff is always a little anxious about, because just the wording of the ordinance was confusing and to how to apply it. And so it's something we wanted to look at, because if it's confusing to us, then we read it regularly. It's definitely going to be confusing to customers coming in. So a lot of it is just clarification to really make it much easier to read, making sure that we're consistent. There were words that were used within the ordinance, such as stealth facility, but then were not defined in the definitions section. So just making sure that those things were very clear. The state laws required that wireless communication facilities that are doing minor expansions, you cannot require a discretionary permit. So they just have to go straight through a building permit. So removing that requirement from the ordinance, but then adding in, you can have some development standards that you look at for the building permit. So making sure that if there's an existing tower, that they're adding additional height, that whatever stealthing material they use for the main tower, that they're doing that for the addition. As crazy it is to believe, we've seen pictures of, as they have, say it's a pine tree, and then they do an addition, and then it's just a metal pole that comes out of the top of it. So it's just making sure if it's a pine tree, you continue that design. And then again, what the laws required is that it's very specific within your ordinance what has to be submitted as part of an application for a wireless communication facility. So we've clarified that, added in the requirement for a pre-development meeting, that they provide a visual simulation of exactly what the tower is going to look like, and any special studies that are needed. So really clarifying the application requirements. So that summarizes my two sections. Are there any questions on the landscaping or the wireless communication?
Any questions here on the dais? From those in attendance, any questions? Can't see that far back. Okay. I'd like to thank you both. This item will be discussed as part of the formal agenda during our regularly scheduled council meeting, and we'll be taking action on it at that time. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn, and we will reconvene at 6.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned.